Hey folks, how's everybody doing today? Chris Breton, Active Countermeasures. It is straight up 1 o'clock on the hour, but I'm going to give it about 30 more seconds to get going. I'll talk a little bit about like why we're doing this class, because we're offering it for free. People love to charge for training. Why aren't we charging for the training? Threat hunting's new, so there's two things for me. One is, oh my God, this is a huge problem. You know, we're still looking at like a 6-month time between when a site gets whacked and when we actually figure out, oh my God, somebody's on our internal network. There's been some examples out there in the wild that just really, I think, highlight how bad things are. Starwood's a great example for me. You know, when you look at what happened with Starwood, Starwood had their PCI attestation. They continued to receive their PCI attestation year after year. They had their SOC 2. I seem to remember hearing they had their ISO 27001, so they had those security attestations as well. They had a due diligence inspection when Hyatt came in and bought them out. And even with all that going on, their network was owned, credit card information was getting siphoned out, and that went on for 4.5 years. And it was a third party that figured out, hey, you guys have a problem you might want to go in and take care of. So, you know, the need to be able to identify when are there bad guys on my network, you know, this is huge. This is a huge problem we need to solve. So the reason John and I have been doing these for free is we want to get the information out there. There's no real standards. There's no real, you know, when you say the word threat hunting, 5 different people, they may interpret it 5 different ways. And that just kind of has to stop. So a lot of this is to kind of help get that information out there, get that baseline going, in order to make sure everybody's kind of up to speed on the technology, which is why we're doing this 6-part series. And today we're going to be talking about other things you can do once you figure out, hey, I've got some sort of automated process that's communicating with a system out on the internet. So we're going to go through and do a quick run through this stuff today. So nothing's changed. You know, in other words, last week I spent a long time talking about here's how to detect beacons, here's how to detect long connections, here's how to detect those C2, that C2 traffic that's kind of a combination between the two. You know, it beacons, but only about once an hour, once every half hour to make it, you know, a little bit even a little bit more stealthy. Metinterpreter's good at doing that. So you still want to start with that. That's kind of our baseline. You know, you think about, you know, a lot of us have hundreds of millions of connections taking place out to the internet every day. We don't want to have to try and scrutinize all of them. So we need a way to kind of say, okay, we've got 100,000 connections. How do I wean that down to something smaller? And then how do I make that subset smaller? And how do I make that subset smaller? So that's really the process we're kind of focusing on here. And I'm going to get more into process in a later module. But the idea is, you know, so we have, let's say, a day's worth of data. We've gone through that data and we've looked at it and we've said, I think I've got some long extended connections here and I think I've got some beacons over there. I want to dig in a little bit further. That's what we're going to be talking about this week. How do you go in and how do you actually dig in a little bit deeper? Now, I find it useful to kind of use a point system. You know, in other words, you don't want to leave this stuff subjective. Especially if you have like a security operations center. You don't want a situation where one analyst is going to, you know, let's say see 2 abnormal characteristics and then flag it and want to go in an incident mode, but somebody else feels like they need to have 6 or 7. You need to have a standard within the organization. And the easiest way to do that is to go through and just create a point system. So you can go through and you can say, you know, we're going to use a 0 to 100 scale. And if I rate 2 systems communicating with each other, if I give that a threat rating of 0, that's my way of saying, yeah, I am pretty certain this is a safe connection. I don't need to worry about this. If I rate it as 100, yeah, okay, we're in really bad shape and we need to kick in an incident response mode. You know, forensics needs to get involved. Most of the time, we're going to be someplace in the middle, though. And, you know, how do we move more towards that 0 or 100 so we can make a proper determination on what to do about this traffic? That's really the key. Because I think I've said this before, you know, when you look at what's a threat hunter's job, it's to go through, and this keeps falling out of my ear and no one's talking to me anyway, so I'm just going to drop it out. But, you know, it's to make that determination. Is it safe? Is it not? You know, at the end of the day, that's what threat hunting is all about. Once you get outside of that, yeah, I think it is actually compromised. Okay, now we're into incident response. Now we're into forensics. Now we're into some other discipline. But when you look at the threat hunting discipline itself, it's to go in and make this determination. The beaconings, the long connections, those should be high modifiers. What I mean by that is if I see like 2 connections go out to the internet, but I don't recognize the user agent of the HTTP session, yeah, I'm not going to pay a whole lot of attention to that because you get oddball stuff on occasion. Not everybody knows how to write good code, especially when it comes to connecting to other external systems, especially when you start getting into things like Internet of Things devices. So you're going to have the abnormal talkers on occasion, and you don't want to burn a lot of cycles on those. So your high modifier should be, is there a persistent connection there? Does it look like my internal system is in regular communications with some host out on the internet? If so, okay, that's what sparks a lot of this additional investigation. The stuff we're going to talk about today, these are all minor modifiers. So, hey, the digital certificate was self-signed. Okay, if I see one connection to a system with a self-signed digital certificate, I don't care. If I see something beaconing every 10 minutes, right on the 10-minute mark, and it's going to a system with a self-signed digital certificate or a freely issued digital certificate, yeah, that makes me worry even more about that thing. Also, negative points are okay, meaning as we go through and collect evidence, we may see things and say, that looks really normal and that's something I can explain. That can actually subtract points away. So give you an example, I may go in and I may see something that's a solid beacon. I look at that and I say, oh yeah, that is the definition of a beacon. Every 15 minutes it's connecting to that external system. Cool, I'm going to give it 80 points. Now I go in and I, excuse me, I dig in a little bit deeper and I see that it's UDP 123 traffic that has an NTP, that's using the NTP protocol going to a server named stratum.mydomain.com. Okay, well, wait a minute. So that it looks like NTP. It's using the NTP port. It's going to what seems to be described as an NTP server. If I don't see it on any, threat intel lists or anything like that, that should, subtract away those 80 points. So again, not everything's positive. Sometimes you look at these and say, yeah, no, this is helping me figure out this is actually a safe system. So the minor modifiers we're going to go through today, we're going to start talking about protocol itself. How do we go through doing analysis on that? We're also going to want to do an analysis on the external system, which is going to be mostly reputational based. And then we're going to want to look at the internal system as well. And again, for me, the order is important because from my experience, again, we've got 100 million connections and we want to put as many of them to the side as quickly as we can. Going through this order in this exact order seems to do that the quickest for me. And I'll talk about why on some of these as we go through. Now, the first thing to look for is just unexpected applications being used or unexpected port usage. I see traffic leaving my network going to TCP port 5222. And I look at that and I say, yeah, I don't know what it is. Well, you got to know what it is. You've got to understand it. Anything crossing your perimeter, there should be a business need for it. Meaning that I should always be able to tie that back to here's some function or service we need in order to do business. If you can't tie something back, that's a problem. If you can't understand it, that's a problem. I know folks, and I've done it myself. Hey, let's just block it, see who complains. Sometimes that's a valid, method of troubleshooting. It depends on the environment you're in, obviously, but you got to understand these things. And once you see them, you need to kind of understand, why are they even there? The first 2 minor bullet items I have down the bottom, these are both remote access tools. So, Chrome Remote Desktop, this may be, someone may have set up their work system with Chrome Remote Desktop so they can get to it externally. Okay, that, sounds kind of useful, but, are they using proper authentication? Are they using an easily guessable password? Can this connection be hijacked? There might be a legitimate business need for that. They need to be able to remotely access their desktop, but is it something you actually want taking place? Again, that's something that needs to be part of this investigation. So the first place to look is there anything going on that I just don't understand? So again, if I've got something beaconing out and it's beaconing using a protocol I don't understand, I got to go in, I got to do that research, I got to figure out what's going on. The other thing you want to look for, and this is a great key, is unknown application on a standard port. What I mean by that is I'm looking at TCP/80 traffic, but there's no user agent that goes by. There's no normal HTTP negotiation taking place. Or I'm looking at a TCP 443 connection, which should be HTTPS, which means I should see the client send an SSL client hello packet, identifying, hey, here's the methods of data privacy and authentication that I want to use. And then I should see the server send back a digital certificate along with its handshake to say, okay, out of the stuff that you want to use, here's what I support as well. I should see all of that taking place on TCP 53. If I don't see that, oh, somebody's tunneling. Somebody's trying to blow something through. Now, why would attackers do this? Well, when an attacker drops malware on your network, we talked about this, I think, way back in the first class. When an attacker drops malware on your network, one of the first things they need to figure out is, how do I get my traffic back out to the internet? In other words, I've compromised this internal system. How do I go about making sure that your firewall isn't going to block this traffic as it leaves and goes to the internet? And one of the easiest ways to do that is to pick a port or an application that people always leave open. TCP 443 HTTPS is a good one for a couple of reasons. One is everybody uses it, so it's most likely to be open. Also, since it's encrypted, a lot of people don't inspect it. There's a lot of things we look for on TCP 80 that we don't bother looking for on TCP 443, even though they're technically both using HTTP, but we don't look for it on TCP 443 because, again, we expect that to be an encrypted session. So a lot of attackers will try and just tunnel their traffic out on that. VS Agent is probably a great example of that. So that's something to go in and look for. Now, I'm not talking about an application on a non-standard port. A lot of folks do that by practice. I know I do. So like SSH listening on something else besides TCP/22 is a great example of that. I may, this is not a security thing. This is more of I want to reduce the amount of log information I got to review kind of thing. So instead of having it listen on TCP/22 and having to deal with, everybody coming by and seeing if they can, guess a default login name, I might have it listen on 10,022 or something like that, so that folks are less likely to beat up on it. So any log entries that do get generated from login traffic, that now becomes a little bit more interesting to me. So when I talk about this, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, TCP/22 should be SSH, but I'm not seeing SSH header information going by. That's when I need to go in and kind of focus in a little bit further to say, yeah, okay, if it's not SSH, what is actually taking place here? And bro/Zeek, bro being the old name for the tool, Zeek being the new name for the tool, is actually a great utility for detecting this type of information. Zeek detects over 50 different applications. So there's a lot of decoding capability built into it. And the guys who wrote it actually did something really cool with it, which is every time they see a session go by, they actually go through every single protocol analyzer. So with a lot of tools, when they see traffic going to TCP/80, they'll label it HTTP. Well, that doesn't mean the connection was HTTP compliant. They're just using the well-known name, so it's a little bit easier for you to figure out. Zeek doesn't do that, though. What Zeek will do is Zeek will say, well, let me try the HTTP decoder. Oh, that doesn't look like HTTP. Okay, let me try the SSH decoder. Let me try the MySQL decoder. And it'll go through the entire list. And if it doesn't get a match against the 50 plus, it'll go through and list it and say, hey, I don't know what it is. But if it does recognize it, it'll go through and tell you what it is. This is great for finding applications running on non-standard ports. And again, it's also great to identify well-known ports that have something tunneling through it, which is a protocol that you don't expect. It's fairly straightforward to go through and write your own analyzers. So if you have a protocol you're working with, like Modbus, or I got HL7 is a great example in here. That was one I was actually surprised there isn't an analyzer for yet, just because HL7 that's like the glue that holds the healthcare industry together, and oh my God, it's problematic. That would be a good one to be able to go in and take a look for, but there isn't an analyzer written for it yet. But you could go through and write one up for yourself. So again, this is a great tool. So if I'm seeing a beacon and it's going on TCP 443, one of the things I want to look at, is it HTTPS? Excuse me, is it actually SSL or TLS that's going across that port connection? Now, where do you find this information with Zeek? Well, it's in the con log. The con log has a lot of information in it. And if you use Bro and you haven't run across this tool yet, oh my God, I'm about to make your life so much easier. There's a tool that comes with Zeek called BroCut. And BroCut is just an awesome tool because it allows you to go in and specify these specific fields that you want to say and just ignore everything else that might be in there. A good example is every connection has an ID number assigned to it. So Zeek will assign an ID number. And what that allows it to do is if it records information in the con log and the HTTP log and maybe the files log and a couple other different places, you can tie all those together with this ID number that's there. Well, if you're not tying together multiple log files, you don't care. So why even bother looking at it? So as you can see here, I'm telling BroCut, I want to see the source IP address, the destination IP address. I want to see the destination port it was talking to. I want to see the protocol. And then service identifies that I want to see the application layer that was being sent across that. Now, if you look at column, what is it, 2-4, column 5, you'll see the first line is labeled as SSH. So this was a connection going to TCP 22. Zeek saw the SSH header going by, so it labeled it as SSH. Cool. The next line you'll notice, okay, we have another connection going to port 22 from a different IP address. There's no SSH header that takes place. So this could be a couple of things. The clue for me is the last two fields are how many bytes were sent by the client and how many bytes were sent by the server. Notice the client sent 344 bytes, the server did not send anything. What that says to me is this is probably somebody just doing a port scan, meaning that they may not have actually tried to negotiate with the server. They may have actually just tried to, see if the port's open or not, and that's it. Notice we got the DNS header labeled here, but those dashes. So the dashes means that Zeek went through all 50 of the different applications that it knows about, couldn't find a single match, and that's when it'll go back and it'll show you the dash. Now, some of these, don't freak out if you see this on a single connection, because a lot of times the information that Zeek needs takes place at the beginning of the session, meaning that let's say I start my packet sniffer, but the 3-packet handshake has already taken place. Well, that information I needed to see to be able to identify the application layer may have already gone by. So Zeek may go through and identify, a dash symbol and say, hey, I can't tell you what this app is. And it's not necessarily it was an app it didn't recognize. It was just that it, happened, we didn't start sniffing until after the handshake took place. So anytime I see that, if I want to verify, did it actually not recognize the application layer, I always go in and kind of take a look at the timing. And if I see, oh yeah, okay, it's reporting this, within 10 seconds of when I started my packet capture, yeah, okay, it probably just missed the header as it went by. UDP stuff, you should always see the header because that, UDP connection list, that information is always there. Unexpected protocol use. So what I mean here is, so we were talking about a well-known port, but something being tunneled through it. So TCP 443 and there's no SSL client hello, there's no digital certificate that goes by, something's tunneling through it. What I'm talking about here is everything is compliant, but the protocol is being used in a different way than you might normally see it being used. And I've got a decent example for you here. We're going to go through a DNS example because that's just a good one we all need to go in and kind of worry about. But this does mean you need to kind of understand how these protocols work. So it's good to have a baseline of what is normal so that, when you spot abnormal, it's something that kind of sticks out for you. So here's a question to ponder. How many fully qualified domain names does it make sense for a domain to expose to other people out on the internet? In other words, we've set up, we have a software company called example.com. How many systems are we going to put in our DNS records so that people out on the internet can actually access them? And if you stop and think about it, for most of us, that number is pretty small. It's like 10 or less, because we're going to have a web server. We might have a client, a customer portal or a support portal, depending upon what we're doing. We might have a mail server if we haven't outsourced that. We might have a couple of DNS servers, and probably not much more than that. So, how many does it make sense for most environments? The number's small. It's like 5 or less than that. I have 10 here, but either way, it's single digits. Then you get into environments that everybody's heard of: Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and they offer services on the internet that require them to have multiple hosts running. Akamai does, front-end load balancing for a lot of different websites that are out there. So they have servers and data centers all over the world. So they have thousands of systems type of thing. Hundreds are online at any given time, and they may scale up and scale down a little bit as they go through. So there's two parts to this. One is, how many does it make sense to show to people on the internet? And part of this is also, how many of those does it make sense that your domain went out and tried to resolve? In other words, Akamai might have 2,000 servers online right now, but how many Akamai customers are you actually going to try and access in the course of 24 hours and get exposed to the DNS information for each of those servers? The number ends up being a lot less than that. I have seen 800 once. And the one time I saw 800, it was a large international company. They were using Amazon for EC2 services, and a lot of the stuff they were looking up was within EC2. Outside of that, 600 max, is what you're going to say. You should never really see more than that in any domain names associated. If you get above 1,000, that's where things start getting suspicious. DNS can be used to tunnel C2 traffic. So the concept is, my C2 server is actually the authoritative name servers for my domain. Compromised systems do lookups that bring them to that server, and the lookup is kind of a secret handshake to be able to say, hey, I'm here, I'm compromised, do you have anything for me to do? And one of the ways they'll make sure that they're getting an answer from the C2 server out on the internet and not the local resolver just handing me cached information is they'll change the lookup they're doing every single time. Because if I look up, www.example.com, there might be a TTL associated with it. Or even if there isn't, my local DNS server might be pre-configured to say, cache that information. Remember that for some specified period of time. Regardless of what the TTL is, I always want to remember things for at least an hour. Something like that might be set. So as a bad guy, I got to make sure I'm not getting stuck in that local cache. I'm always getting back to the C2 server. The only way to do that, change the query I'm doing each time. Well, this means that every time that thing beacons out, it generates a new DNS record. So if we can go in and if we can look at how many fully qualified domain names are associated with a specific domain, and we see any that have 1,000 fully qualified domain names associated with them or more, that could very well be somebody tunneling C2 traffic through DNS, and it's something we need to go in and focus in on. Now, there's a couple of tools that'll go through and kind of help you work through this, but I wanted to kind of start with the basics, and I wanted to come up with something that would kind of work for everybody. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to kind of work you through this now. But it requires you to have all of the DNS queries for the previous 24 hours. Now, this could be packet captures, and I'm going to work with packet captures just because it's a little bit more difficult. But it could also be, if you've got your DNS query logs, you could go through and you could use the same process on your DNS query logs. So here's what we're doing. So I've got a PCAP file named suspect-dns.pcap. So that is a PCAP file that I went through. Let's say I ran TCP dump, and I said anything going to UDP or TCP 53, I want to capture that traffic. So it's got DNS traffic in it only, and I've got a capture of the, what went out, what came back as a response, and I just shoved it all into one file. Now, if you've ever looked at TCP dump output, there's a lot of information there, and not all of it is stuff we care about, and sometimes it's, you can't really get the application layer, the name of that fully qualified domain name that was looked up, unless I get even more information as part of the output, and oh my God, that gives us a lot to sort through. One of the best ways to get around that is to use T-Shark. T-Shark is a tool that's included with Wireshark. A lot of people don't even know it's there because it's a command line based tool. T-Shark is awesome. So if you take a look at the command switches I have here right at the very top, you'll see T-Shark-R suspect-DNS PCAP. So I'm saying T-Shark, read this capture file, don't sniff on the local Ethernet interface. Then I'm saying -t fields. What that means is I don't want T-Shark to print out the default information it would normally show for each packet. I want to specify the exact information I wanted to print out. And -e separator equals comma, I want to separate all of the fields that I specify with a comma. By default, it does it with space. We're actually going to be manipulating the data a little bit later. So I don't want to use a space. I want to use something that's a little bit easier to dump through cut and stuff like that. So I'm using commas here. And then my -e allows me to identify each of the fields that I want to go through and grab. So I'm grabbing source IP address, who did the query, destination IP address, where did it go, query type. So my query type is going to identify what type of query took place. Now this is 16. This is kind of interesting because 16 is a text record query. And it's kind of odd to see so many text record queries going by. Normally that I should see a type of 1, which is an A query. So that's here's a name, give me back an IP. Or type 28, which is a quad A query. Hey, here's a name, I want back the IPv6 address that's associated with it. Well, we've got 16 here, and that's kind of interesting. And I'm actually going to kind of loop back to that a little bit. And then after that, DNS query name. So I want to see what was the query that took place. So here is our host name that's part of this domain. And you can see we're kind of rotating through a bunch of different host names here. And you can see, yeah, this is programmed, right? This is not something a human came up with. At least, oh my God, I hope not, because otherwise they've got OCD worse than I do. But I pumped it through head here, and the only reason I pumped it through head was so I could show you what the lines of output look like. That's why we got this T-Shark error here. An error occurred while printing packets. That happened because my T-Shark command is trying to run through all the packets in the capture file. Head is saying I only cared about the first 10 lines, and then I closed the feed. I closed the write capability. So that's why the pipe broke, because head closes the pipe after 10 lines of output. So if you're grabbing everything and not using head, you won't get that error. But I pumped it to head. What you really want to do is you want to send it to a file. And that's what I have on this last line here. So the rest of this is exactly the same. The only difference is I'm saying send it to suspect-dns.csv. So I'm saying, okay, I want to create a comma-separated file with all of this information. Now, this last command here, this is actually what we really want to do, but I wanted to break it out and kind of show you the progress as it's going through because I got a lot going on here. So what I'm doing is I'm using cut, and I'm telling cut -d, I want to define my delimiter is comma. Remember, we used a comma between each of our fields. And then I'm saying I'm interested in field 4, which if I come back here, field 1 is source IP, 2, 3, 4 is that query name. So cut is saying grab that only and grab it out of this particular file. Then I'm saying sort it. So what it's going to do is it's going to look at the very first character in that fully qualified domain name, sort, and get everything sorted in the correct order. And then I'm saying only give me unique instances. If I don't do that, if I just sort it and that's it, I'm going to see how many queries went by. And I'm not interested in how many queries. What I'm interested in is the number of unique host names associated with that remote domain. Then I go through and reverse the order of characters on the line, and I end up with something like this. So here's my host name here, and notice it's written backwards. And then here's my domain name, see, .com, all written backwards. Why did I sort it backwards? Because what I want to do is I want to identify how many hosts are associated with this domain. And I don't know if some of these answers are going to have subdomains in it. In other words, here's my host, here's my domain, but it could be host, subdomain, and then the domain. If so, if I go in and try and cut out like field 4, I'm going to miss it and everything will shift and it'll be bad. So by reversing the order of the characters on the line, I'm guaranteed the first thing that's here, top level domain. Next thing after that is the domain I'm interested in. Everything after that might be a host name, might be a subdomain and then a host name. Don't know, don't care, because I'm going to focus in on just these first 2 fields and that's it. So in this line, I've got exactly the same information, except I've gone in and I've run the cut command again, only this time I'm saying my field separator is a period. In other words, I'm taking top level domain, the domain. I'm breaking that all into individual fields, and then I'm saying I'm only interested in fields 1 and 2. I'm only interested in the top level domain and the actual domain name itself. Everything after that, just ignore it. And then I printed that output here, and you can see we got a blank line. Yeah, okay, black lines happen, right? And then I get the domain names listed after that. Now, excuse me. So this very last command, we've covered everything up to this reverse right here where we fix things here. Now all I did was I just said sort it, and I pumped it through unique to say count the number of unique instances of each, and lo and behold, this is what we get down here. So I started with output that looked like this, where everything's kind of mixed together. What I end up with, because of this last line, is an identification of there are 62,466 fully qualified domain names associated with this domain. Well, we said the number to worry about is 1,000. So anything over 1,000, yeah, that's something to worry about here. If I want to prioritize this list, I could go through and I could say unique-C-R, reverse the sort order. So now my domains with the highest number of fully qualified domain names ends up at the top of the list. Those are the ones I go in and pay attention to first. So again, if I have a C2 channel, that may be an indication of, or excuse me, if I have a C2 channel, they're going to be doing a lot of lookups for different fully qualified domain names. Here's an easy way to go in and find it. I could do the same thing with DNS queries. One thing I did not cover here, but it's something that may be worth taking what I just showed you and adapting it a little bit to go in and look for it. Remember we talked about this is a text field and this is odd. One of the things I may want to go through and do is say, how many of each different query type am I doing for each domain? In other words, if I have a domain that has 62,000 text queries associated with it, yeah, that's abnormal. That's something I may want to pay attention to. Now, what we did should already catch the C2 channel. What looking for the text records is good for is data exfiltration. If there's a C2 channel and they're actually moving data, that may help me pin that down as well. So just an adaptation you can do off of this. So bonus checks. In other words, additional things we can go through and do here. So I have a domain. So let me kind of walk you through this one a little bit. So imagine I go through and I look and I see Akamai. And Akamai has 300 fully qualified domain names associated with it. Well, stop and think about that from a logical perspective. My DNS server has looked up 300 different fully qualified domain names out within Akamai. How many internal systems should I see now connecting out to Akamai? I'd expect at least a few, right? At least maybe 20, maybe more than that, right? It was enough to generate, a couple hundred different unique host names. I'd expect to see a bunch of different systems connecting to that. Now, one of the interesting things about C2, one of the interesting things about this type of behavior here is that my DNS server goes out and does these queries and nobody ever visits the domain. So if I go in and I look at a domain and I see that, it has 200 fully qualified domain names associated with it, but the only thing that ever talked to it was my DNS servers and that's it, ooh, that's a red flag. Now, there is a false positive here. And the false positive is security tools. There are some security tools that go out and do a lot of lookups, for things like Intel threat feeds and stuff like that. So look at the source that's generating these. You might find out it's one of the security software packages that you purchase. There is a false positive for this, so don't freak out. But outside of that, yeah, this is something really suspicious and it's worth going in and paying attention to. And a double bonus on this, which is, excuse me, is when somebody connected to a system, did they do a DNS query first? In other words, if you think about like your firewall log, that destination IP field is going to identify, here's all the IP addresses that people talk to. If I'm recording DNS queries and responses, I should be able to match a response against each one of those IP addresses we went to. In other words, it's very rare to do a connection based on IP address. You know, IT people may do it on occasion, although usually it's internal systems. We may do it on occasion, but for your regular user, you know, nobody understands IP addresses. Nobody does direct connections to it. So if you see that, that may be suspicious. Now, again, if it's that on its own, yeah, I don't know if I'd necessarily freak out about it. But if I see something beaconing, or if I see a long connection that's been established and they got there based on IP, they didn't get there based on fully qualified domain name, oh, that's worth paying attention to. Now, one of the challenges with this is that most DNS logs do not log the answer, meaning you'll see the query that went out, you'll see who made the query, you won't see what the response is that comes back. So you may not be able to do this with your DNS logs unless you got some way to go in and kind of turn on that feature. Excuse me. Zeek will do this. So if you've got Zeek running and it's monitoring all your traffic going to the internet, it'll see what everybody connected to, and it'll see all the answers that came back. You can go in and you can match up between those two different records. So if somebody's trying to get to it based directly on the IP address only, that's worth paying attention to. The other reason that it's good to kind of have this process in place anyway is you kind of want to, sometimes you want to know what was the fully qualified domain name they're trying to get to. In other words, if I have an internal system and it's connecting to somebody and I don't understand who or why, knowing what domain it is can be kind of helpful. So, you know, imagine I have a Linux system and it's connecting out to an IP address on a regular basis and I don't know why, but then I look and I see, oh, it's connecting to a system within ubuntu.com and it's an Ubuntu system. Okay, so this might be normal and I just don't understand it yet. That's probably okay. But if it's going to, you know, 578399957.com, well, what the heck is that? You know, that's more of an indication that, yeah, something mischievous may be taking place here. So other things we can do as a minor modifier are things like look at the user agent being involved. So here, I've gone through the HTTP log, and again, I've used Brocut, and I've gone in with Brocut just to say, hey, just grab the user agent. That's all I'm really interested in. You know, there's additional information in that file, like what IP made the request, where was it going to, what was the method that was used, you know, was it GET, was it a PUT, what was the URI that was queried. You know, you've got a lot of useful information in there. But if I'm interested in unique user agents only, then one of the easiest ways to get that is just grab the user agent only. Sort it out, count them out, sort it again to put it in prioritized order because the lowest number is going to be the most unique in my environment. In other words, if I look at this output, you know, these last two lines, these are pretty common. This one would normally worry me, right? Anytime we see PowerShell, we get nervous. But I'm seeing I've got 55 systems doing that. That may be normal for my environment. Where you need to worry is the one-offs, right? I have one, maybe two systems that are using a user agent field that I just don't recognize. That becomes suspicious, especially if it's associated with a beacon or a long connection. Now, it's saying it's Python making this connection. Okay, so somebody's running Python to go out and connect to web servers. That could be something scripted I need to worry about. That could be something that's perfectly normal. One of the nice things about this is once I see that, I can go back into that log file and say, okay, show me any instances where Python, you know, shows up in a line, and now I'm going to see that when it's its user agent field. So here is all the output that's associated with that line, and notice Python's going to changelogs.ubuntu.com. It's going to meta release, you know, what's that, ITS. LTS, long-term support. So again, I look at this, it's a one-off, that looks suspicious to me, but now when I look at the full data that's associated with it, including the fully qualified domain name, yeah, okay, now it makes a whole lot more sense to me. So this is something that's actually probably normal. But again, this is a good way to go through and kind of verify, you know, if the connection is using a user agent that I recognize, or I can at least explain, I'm less likely to be suspicious about that persistent connection. Other things to look at are things like the SSL Hello packet that goes by. Now, this gets a little weird because you can have two systems that support, or two clients that support the same level of authentication and data privacy. They just express it slightly differently. In other words, they might prioritize things slightly differently. And you want to be able to flag those. So I can't necessarily go in and say, look for AES 256. What I'm really interested in is trying to negotiate that first, or is it trying to negotiate it last? So one of the simplest ways to do that is to just go in and create a hash of that SSL hello packet. Well, there's a tool that does that for you. It's called JA3. So JA3 is a plugin module. It does not come with Zeek by default. You have to grab it and install it, but that's not a big deal. And then you have to enable it, which again is not a big deal. But what that will do is for any SSL TLS client requests that go out, it'll create a hash of that client request. And then you can go through and use the same techniques we were talking about with user agent to see, is this unique within my environment? If so, what domain is it going to? I can start going in doing a deeper investigation from there. So again, if I have an internal system that's beaconing out to some IP address on the internet and it's using TCP 443 and I can see, it's using HTTPS. Okay, if the SSL client hello is unique versus the rest of my environment, that makes it a little bit more suspicious for me. So protocol usage was okay, but the uniqueness, now that becomes a little bit of a red flag for me. So again, I wouldn't flag this just because it's unique, but if it's combined with a beacon or a long connection, yeah, that's when it becomes far more interesting to me. The other thing we can do, and actually Bro/Zeek will do this for you, is go in and validate the digital certificate. So Zeek can go through and say, oh, okay, here's a digital certificate. It can actually go back to the chain authority and check it and see, is this valid? Or is somebody using a bad digital certificate? Now, there is a pecking order with this. What I've noticed is that Zeek will go through and it has an order of things it'll check. So it'll check for things like, was the issue date, now or in the past? Then it'll look and see, has this thing expired? Then it'll go in and it'll do a third-party verification. So you may come in and you may see something like, the digital certificate was expired, and that is a problem. But there might actually be additional problems with that digital certificate that you won't notice until you look at it. Like it's a self-signed cert, or it was issued by a free authority, or the hash, the hash is wrong. The hash doesn't match. So what I like to do is go, you can, again, leverage Zeek for this, but if Zeek goes in and flags something, unable to get local issuers of the certificate, go in and look at it. Go in and validate the rest of those fields for yourself. Because if I'm looking at something and I see, oh, it's, was talking to a server with the digital certificate expired, if the digital certificate was valid but it's expired, I'm far less worried about that versus, oh, the hash doesn't match. It actually looks like this cert is coming from a server that shouldn't be using it. But you're not going to see that unless you kind of dig in a little bit deeper yourself. Okay, so that's protocol. So, we've gone in and we've done a deep analysis on the communications that are taking place. Now let's move to one of the endpoints. Let's start with the system out on the internet. One of the best places to start is just some simple data associated with that destination IP. So things like, what ASN is a part of, who manages that. Sometimes that can kind of point us in the right direction. We had an early customer that detected a couple of beacons on their network, and the first thing that stood out for them about it was that the ASN was associated with a Chinese company, and they knew they did not have a field office or a business partner located in China, and that immediately made it interesting that they have 3 systems beaconing to China and they can't come up with a valid business reason for that. So geolocation information, sometimes, we all know, yeah, it's not 100% accurate, right? It goes to where is the company located versus necessarily where the IP address is located. Sometimes it can be a little bit off, but it's a good big stick. It's good to get you at least in the right general geographic area a majority of the time. It's definitely worth going in and taking a look at. Who's responsible for that IP address? Is there a fully qualified domain name associated with it? Sometimes that can be helpful. Now that's different than what we were talking about before. Before we were talking about looking at the DNS query and looking at what the user was trying to look up when they went to that IP address. That can be helpful. This is different because now what we're doing is we're saying, what host name is associated with that IP, and that may not match what the client went to. So I might try and get to www.example.com, but when I do a PTR record lookup on the IP address, I might end up at Akamai or Amazon, or I might end up at some sort of CDN network. So this may differ, and again, it's additional data points we can collect and make a good determination. Am I looking at potential C2, yes or no? Also, ask yourself some basic questions, like, do you recognize that target organization? If it's going to Microsoft, yeah, okay, Microsoft does a pretty good job of locking their network down, especially anything on ASN 8075. So if it's associated with that, yeah, okay, yeah, I'm not going to trust it outright, but I'm going to be less concerned than if I started going to China and don't have business partners there. So, you get the idea. The other thing to look at, and this one has paid off in spades for a number of our customers, is look at who the traffic is going to and are they a current vendor. We've had a couple of customers that have bought into like an accounting software package, or some sort of complicated server package that comes with a service contract that includes remote management, meaning they want to be able to remotely come in and get access to that server in order to manage it, which means it's running like some sort of remote access software on it, and they cancel the contract. They stop doing business with the vendor. They don't take the server offline yet, though. Well, that remote company can still get access to that. Black Hills has actually been kind of digging into this, and I don't want to steal any thunder, but they've been finding a number of problems with this. Things like that third-party company gets compromised, and now all of these become conduits to be able to get into everybody else. This is actually getting really popular. And I talked about this back on the, I think I talked about this back on the first day when we were talking about no, sorry, I'm confusing this with another presentation. So I didn't talk about this on the first day, so let's talk about it now. U.S. government, there was an article in, I think it was the Wall Street Journal back in January, where they did a really great story on talking about how susceptible is the U.S. electrical power grid to attack from outside countries. And the bottom line is more than any of us should feel comfortable with. But one of the attacks they talked through was what appears to be a Russian sourced attack, And what they did is, rather than going directly after the power companies, they started going after support vendors. They went after things like, who's the vendor that is responsible for managing the air conditioning units that are inside of the facilities? Because if they can compromise that air conditioning vendor probably has, you guessed it, remote access to the network to be able to get in and manage a remote system. If they can whack the vendor, they can now come across that same VPN, jump off of that system. So, they had found that there was 64 different targets that were identified that they wanted to use as part of this campaign to go after the U.S. power grid. And at the time the story had been written, 24 out of the 60 or so had been compromised, meaning that, yeah, they made some pretty good inroads, a scary amount of inroads. So again, current business partners, especially if it's remote access, if it's on the network, make damn sure it should still be there. Even if they are a current vendor, hey, it's not so hard to turn on and off firewall rules as needed and only give them access when they actually need access to that system. The other thing we've run across is a lot of these vendors use standard passwords everywhere. I dealt with one organization where every single one of their customers had the same login name and password on that system. So if you could get a list of their customers and you could figure out the login name and password on their system that they dropped in your network, that now works everywhere. That's kind of a scary concept. The other thing you can do is you can go through and check threat intel feeds. Be careful with this. I kind of prefaced some of this last week a little bit too. Threat intel feeds, my issue with threat intel feeds is that the internet moves too fast. It's kind of like saying, to me, they're in the same boat that antivirus is in. With antivirus was great in the 90s. When viruses were getting propagated by floppy disk, You could get updates faster than the virus would probably make it to a floppy you might handle. So you would get great protection that way. Well, once we went to the internet, the pace picked up. And then, now we're at a point today where, and I forget the exact numbers, but, we see 5,000 new strains of malware every minute. It's some insane number like that taking place, to the point where you can't write signatures for it. You can try, and you'll probably catch stuff that's like 6 months old, but it isn't going to catch anything current and new, and it certainly isn't going to catch anything done by a decent attacker that's actually going after your environment specifically. You might catch some script kiddies. You're not going to catch the top actors. So it makes it kind of useless. That's why, hey, we should be using whitelisting today. If you're still using antivirus and you're not using whitelisting, it is time to grow up and move on, because that ship has sailed. And I see threat intel a lot the same way. Threat intel was great probably 10 years ago when attackers didn't move around that much. I think I mentioned last week, I used to work for a registrar, and I used to watch them change the domain they were using multiple times a week, change the IP addresses they were doing multiple times a day. So you get a feed that has IP addresses on a blacklist. And for most of us, the criteria to say, is it working, is, do we get threat intel hits? In other words, do I occasionally see one of my systems trying to talk to one of these IPs, and maybe I block that? When I see that, yay, hey, look, it's working. No, it's not. Go in and do some digging. A lot of times what I found is that a lot of those IPs are like Amazon IPs, within EC2. Okay, anybody who's used EC2 knows if I shut off an instance and turn it back on again, I get a new IP address. So if that, and also I notice a lot of these threat intel feeds, they'll identify when was the information extracted from their database. They won't necessarily tell you when was that information added to the database in the first place. That's important, because if you're banning an IP address that did something evil 6 months ago, oh my God, yeah, no, somebody else is using that IP from now. Nobody's got fixed, bad guys don't have fixed IPs anymore. They're all over the place. So that information is useless to you. You're probably blocking some sort of, business need connection that's actually taking place. So there's a number of issues with threat intel. I find it mildly interesting. So we talked about that scale of a 1 to 100. I tend to add 1 point only if it's on a threat intel feed list. And even then, I want to go off and do the research. If I find out that an IP address that I'm concerned about is a server for C2 traffic, and I go in and I look at the threat intel feed and it was flagged because it sent spam, yeah, no, who cares? They've definitely moved on by now. Nobody keeps trying to spam for that long, not from the same IP. So look at the source, and also look at the amount of data that was moved. If a lot of data has been moved, okay, that makes it more interesting to me, just because I want to be doubly sure that everything's okay. But as a normal practice, 1 point max on this, that's it. But I gave you a couple of different resources you can use here to go off and do lookups. And what's nice is they all have URIs that you can script to just feed an IP address that you're interested in, and it'll come back and give you some information about it. Now let's flip and look at internal systems. So with internal systems, this really varies a lot, because all of us have just really very drastically different capabilities to be able to identify internal systems. I've been in environments where if I needed to say, hey, this IP address did something suspicious, which system was it? The IT folks are like going through DHCP logs to get the MAC address and trying to figure out that way. And, to find out the source system might take a half a day, if not more. No, that's just not tenable. That clearly does not scale. So, what you have available to you, inventory that now. Go through and say, hey, pick a random IP. I need to identify which system that is. Go through that process, what's involved. And if it's too hard, take steps now to figure that out, because you don't want to wait until something actually gets owned and you think you see C2 to go through and start trying to figure a lot of this out. So I gave you some possibilities in this slide. Another possibility is Passer. So Passer is one of the open source tools that we support. So this is free for use. Anybody can download it and use it. And what's cool about Passer is it's pretty lightweight. So you can run this on anything. So if you're running Zeek, and it's monitoring all traffic going to and from the internet, you can run parser on that same system as well and just have it dump information out to a log. You can also, if you can't put it in line, parser collects a scary amount of information just looking at broadcast traffic that goes by. But this is, so parser was written by Bill Stearns, one of our, he's actually, Bill's our CTO. Bill was one of the guys that was involved with P0F, one of the original passive fingerprinting tools. And parser kind of came out of a conversation of, hey, me talking to Bill and saying, hey, so if you had a lot of time and someone would pay you to do it, and you wanted to update P0F to have even greater capability, what would you do? And this is where parser came from. So as I was talking, hopefully you've been kind of looking through the log entries here, because it identifies some really cool stuff. We can see things like, oh, hey, somebody's running PC anywhere. Shodan was, just came in and did a query. I can see, specific devices that are on the network, and it goes through and identifies the model. Bill's adding into the amount of Internet of Things devices that he can go through and he can tag pretty easy. What ports are open on my internal systems? What ports are my internal systems talking to? It's some really good intel on what's going on. So again, this is an open source tool. Anybody can download it, anybody can use it, and it gives you some great information. So what next? So now we're down to scoring. So we've gone through these steps, and ideally we want to be kind of assigning score points as we go. And if we hit 100 or we hit a 0 at any given time, yeah, okay, it's time to stop. Meaning that if I can go in and I can identify that it's the NTP protocol going to UDP 123, I don't need to bother go in doing all these other checks. It's not worth my time. So generate your, figure out your scoring system, go in, assign scores as you go, figure out where you're at. Am I, somewhere between 0 and 10, or am I somewhere between 90 and 100? If so, in either case, I'm ready to disposition. I'm ready to say, here's what I want to do next. And what I do next is, if it's between 0 and 10, I say I deem it as safe, and I go in and create a whitelist entry for it. A whitelist entry just means, hey, tomorrow when the same thing comes up again, I don't see it. It hides it in the data, or it flags it in a way that I know I don't need to investigate it. We don't want to be doing the same work day after day after day. We want the cumulative effect to actually reduce the amount of time it takes us to do this threat hunt. So imagine you go in, you threat hunt your network the first day, and you're probably going to spend 4 or 5 days sorting through the data to figure out, oh my God, what are all these connections? What are these non-standard port communications? You're going to go through and you're going to dig through that. But the next time you do it, it may only take you 2 days. And then the next time you do it, it may only take you a day. And after that, when you start doing threat hunts, it might only take you an hour or 2 hours to sort through 24 hours worth of information. So again, whitelisting is a great way to go through and help expedite this whole process, to make sure we're not revisiting the same things over and over again that we don't need to worry about. Now, if we're between that 90 and 100 range, it's time to go into incident response mode. That'll kick off whatever incident handling procedure I have in place. And hey, look at this. We only have 2 minutes to spare. I do want to open it up to questions, but we've only got a couple minutes. So I'm going to point you to courses@activecountermeasures.com. If you have a question and you don't get a chance to toss it out now, please send it there. So on that note, I'm going to put my earpiece back in so I can hear Jason. Hey, dude.
Hey, Chris.
And do we have any last minute questions?
So I got one question for you. If I have bro logs, what's the easiest way for me to whitelist IPs so I'm not looking at the same safe to me IPs every day?
Oh, pretty straightforward. So I can go through and the easiest way to go through and do that is just create a firewall filter. I can go in and I can create a BP filter within Bro itself, or I can create a filter using whatever the platform is that I got Bro running on. But I can go in and I can be pretty precise with those types of things too. So if it's, let's say it's UDP 123 from this internal IP to that internal IP, I can define it that specific to go in and say, yep, don't bother capturing that information anymore. That would be the easiest way to go through. Excuse me. That would be the easiest way to go through and do that.
Okay. And then one more question. What is your recommendation of the period of time I should be looking at the best accuracy for determining C2 traffic?
So my recommendation is 24 hours. You can work with 12, but it becomes a lot harder. It kind of turns, so a lot of us are in this catch-22, where if we've got really large internet links, if we've got like a 20 gig internet link and it's saturated, that's a ton of capture files to go through and deal with. Now, maybe instead of capture files, I use something like Zeek that'll go through and just extract out the information I care about, and that's it. That may be a good way to go through and reduce that load. But ideally, you want 24 hours. I've seen situations where people have gone in and tried to do a threat hunt with 15 minutes of data. Good luck with that. Because if something's beaconing, even if it's beaconing like every 10 minutes, I'm still only going to get one data point. I'm never going to see that as a beacon. But if I've got 24 hours, well, now I've got 6 data points per hour, and now it's a whole lot easier to figure out that's actually a beacon taking place.
And then the final question is, so let's say you find something, what is the next step? Who do you alert if you're in a small organization? Who do you alert if you're in a medium-sized organization?
So it depends, right? Because who you alert might be you. If I'm the only security person on site, then yeah, I may take off my threat hunting hat and put on my incident response hat and try and figure out where to go from here. Now, what I do kind of depends upon, what regulations I'm controlled by, what's the standard operating procedure for my environment. I've seen places go through and say, hey, we're just going to nuke the system and build a new one. Okay, you can do that, and that will get rid of the malware that was on that system. But that isn't going to help you figure out how did they get in the first place? How do I keep them from getting out in the future? There's a lot you can pull out of forensics that's preventive to make sure you don't keep going through this over and over again. If you feel like you're in over your head, now it may be time to contract a third-party services company. And what's nice about this is that you can tell them, hey, this specific system, I'm pretty certain is compromised, and here's why. And if you can go through and tell them, this is who it's beaconing to, this is the protocol it's using, this is when they're doing it, the forensic analysis at that point becomes a whole lot easier because I've got a good boundary on what I'm looking for. Where forensics is tough is I've got 1,000 systems on my network, one of them might be compromised and I don't know which. Oh my God, going through the logs for that is just hell, and that's if you're lucky. But if you can tell me, oh no, this one system, and here's the time periods you need to work with, that makes it a whole lot easier.
All right, Chris, that's all. Any final words today?
No, that's it for me. I just want to thank everybody for joining, and next week we will be talking about tools.
Sounds good. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.
Thanks, folks.